This is your macroeconomics video on demand shocks. Similar to supply shocks, a demand shock is just a shift in demand, one that tends to be really large. It can also be positive or negative. So a positive demand shock would shift aggregate demand to the right, or an increase, and a negative one would shift it to the left. So a couple of examples here. When you have something like the Great Depression, where banks collapse, the amount of credit people can buy and the amount of money people can get from their regular bank accounts just goes away, that severely cripples aggregate demand or shifts it to the left. And it was such a bad negative demand shock that it affected the US economy for many, many years to come, or it was a long-run change. So when aggregate demand shifts to the left, we refer to this as a recessionary gap. Because aggregate demand shifting to the left causes real GDP to go down, which causes a recession. Our equilibrium is now to the left of our long-run line, and this is referred to as a recessionary gap where there is high unemployment. If aggregate demand shifts to the right, we call it an inflationary gap, because aggregate demand shifting to the right causes price levels to go up, which is inflation. So here's an example. The Great Depression, as we just talked about, the first 4 years of the Great Depression, we saw significant issues with the US economy. So the money supply, which is the amount of currency in circulation, falls 28% because banks collapse and people can't get access to their money. Stock prices fell 90%, which of course affects consumption spending and business or investment spending. And real GDP falls 27% in just those 4 years. That also means the price levels are going down as well. So prices deflate 22%. And unemployment goes up to 25%, which is the highest in US history. So this is all within a 4-year time period. Another big aggregate demand shift or an aggregate demand shock is World War II. So World War II, of course, is a massive war. In these 5 years of World War II, the government spending portion of real GDP rises significantly. So we see a 10 times increase in the amount of government spending that's happening. And of course, government spending shifts aggregate demand to the right. That also means that real GDP is going to rise 90% and price levels are going to go up 20%. So real GDP, it's rising significantly, mostly on the backs of government spending, which will ultimately come from taxes or the US government selling bonds. And a lot of people believe it's this particular positive demand shock that caused unemployment to go to its lowest in US history, which is 1%, and ultimately gets us out of the economic problems from the Great Depression.